Good morning, everybody in the States, that is, and good afternoon to Mariana, who's from the Czech Republic. And I don't know if there's anybody else from Europe that's out there, but thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoyed looking at the vendor videos, and I know you're going to appreciate what's coming up. I'd like to introduce for the 11 of you who were our newcomers today, Dean Smith. Dean is a marvelous man who, when he heard that we were going to cancel our live conference, got in touch with me and asked if we would want to consider running a virtual conference. And we've been through a whole lot since then. We've had focus groups, we've had test webinars to get ready for this, all under the direction of Dean. We really appreciate him, and I'm turning it over to you now, Dean. Thank you very much.
There we go, unmuted. Thanks, Bob, and welcome everybody. It's good to see everybody back that was here yesterday and some new faces as well. I'll just take a couple minutes to talk through the flow of our sessions. For those of you that joined us yesterday, this might be a little bit redundant, although we've made some adjustments. So for this morning, what we'll do is we'll have about 45 minutes of presentation and then about 15 minutes of Q&A, followed by a nice, refreshing 30-minute break. And then we'll come back together and do some breakout groups. And the breakout groups will be focused very specifically on key insights and takeaways that we want you to bring back for a large group discussion. Then you'll get back into a breakout group and talk a bit more about the concrete steps and the actions you can take to really put those into action at your respective organizations. So we'll have about an hour of presentation and Q&A, bit of a break, and about an hour of breakout groups. For the afternoon session, we're going to do something slightly different than what we did yesterday and just offer an optional breakout group in advance of the afternoon session. So the afternoon session is scheduled to start at 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. At 1:30 p.m. for anybody that wants to come in and join an optional breakout group to talk about maybe areas where you need the most help with HPRCT issues, or you just want to network, or whatever you want to do. Those will be an optional session. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we close up the morning. But for the sake of this morning, it is my pleasure to introduce LD Holland. And LD has about 40 years of experience in the electric utility industry, including nuclear maintenance and operations, transmission system operations and maintenance, and a huge body of work and experience related to human performance and cause analysis. He also flies planes, rides motorcycles, all kinds of things. So the Q&A session could go in a lot of different ways. But LD is going to focus on what critical steps really are, the definition of critical steps, and how those critical steps apply from the worker's perspective, and also talk a bit about leadership's role in supporting the understanding and application of those concepts. So with that, LD, a pleasure to have you, and share away.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dean. I'm going to click the button here and see if I can get to the presentation. And you should see that now. Does that look okay?
It is there. And you're in slide mode, but not presentation mode.
1 second. Let's see if I can get. How about that? Good?
There you go.
Okay, great. And thank you. This is awesome. This start this morning, I didn't get to attend yesterday, so I apologize for that. But this start this morning was absolutely amazing. So big shout out to Dean and Bob and Charles and all the folks at HPRCT that's been working behind the scenes. I know this is not a small task, and with everything going on in today's environment, hats off to you folks. I also want to give a shout out to Carmen Lopez. I hope Carmen's online. Carmen's out at Southern Cal Edison, a colleague of mine, and she's really the reason I got back with the HPRCT. I've spent a lot of time back when I was in nuclear with the HPRCT, and we did live presentations and traveled all around the country doing that, and I kind of drifted away when I moved out of nuclear, and now I'm back, and it's great to be back. It's great to see Rob Fisher and Dr. Jake and Todd and some of the folks that that were, mentioned this morning on the actual video part of their vendor video part. So a lot of smart people. And with that said, I kind of put the critical thinking or the thinking critically slide from Einstein up just to kind of kick the thought process off, right? So if you're reading that and you're thinking about what he says, it's interesting that we as an industry or many industries that deal with health and public safety, right? I mean, that's kind of the way I look at it. When I think of human performance and root cause and trending is when we're in those industries that have to deal with health and public safety, it's a little different. And the things we do require certain ways of doing things. And how we get people to do those things is what I want to talk about today. And critical steps, for those of you that's got experience with it, is pretty interesting in those industries, I think. And I'll talk a little bit more about what some of those industries are as we go. But I want to give you a perspective to start out with before I even change gears here with the first slide. Those of you that's been doing this for a while, and I've been around the human performance thing for a while in cause analysis, we look at the practitioner side of that heavily. And we hear these folks talk. I'm one of those folks, Rob, Jake, Todd, all the other folks that are geared up, Sharon, that are here to talk. And these are smart people. And the concepts that these people are sharing are amazing. And when you hear some of these things, you go, wow, why didn't I think of that? But the next question you need to ask yourself when you hear those things and when you take these things away, if you're going back to an organization that has people that touch equipment, you need to start thinking about is how do I take what Rob Fisher just said and make it fit over here in this environment that the temperature is over 100 degrees, I may be outside, I may be up on a pole, I may be underneath a basement. Where do I make that fit and how do I breach that gap? Well, I think that takes perspective from two things, right? The first line worker, which is what we're talking about, the first line, the person who's touching things, and then the leader who's supporting that person and helping that person to understand the why. So I want you to think about those two perspectives. We're going to talk about it in that sense as we go through the presentation this morning, and we'll see what we come up with. So again, as I said, I want to do a two-part discussion here, just kind of the definition of critical step, and I'm sure we'll get some discussion afterwards in the question and answer series about that, and that's great. And then the leadership's role and what we're doing. I found it interesting early on, I guess in my career. I was fortunate enough to come into the generation side of the electric industry in 1980. And I signed up at a nuclear plant that was being built, just north of Charlotte, North Carolina. And I remember a tremendous or amazing thing had just happened in September of 1979. And some of you are going, oh no, the 3 Mile Island, right? And so growing up in the nuclear world, 3 Mile Island was something that I took and said, wow, look at this. And boy, I don't want to be a part of that, right? So coming into that early on as a technician, that was always in the back of my mind is that, and it's so easy to get caught up in the goings on of everyday work in a big organization. And you kind of go, yeah, just running this procedure. I've done this 1,000 times. This is not my first rodeo. I can get this done, but we drift away. And when we drift away, we start to have these things happen. So the critical step definition, as I look at it, brings us back and it refocuses where we need to be focused. And I know a lot of people go, well, procedures are procedures, and boy, these procedures are getting really ridiculous. You know what? I don't disagree with it. But the fact of the matter is we have to make procedures work for the people who's really using those procedures. Think about that. We have to make procedures work from the end user perspective and make sure they understand the why. It's really easy to be in an engineering department, write a big procedure, send it out, say, hey, y'all do this, call me when you're done. And the people that get that procedure all sit around the table and look at each other like a mule at a new gate, and they go, what do they want me to do? So where is the real critical stuff? Where is the stuff that we really got to focus on? And how do we do that? So let me go take the first big step here and throw a definition. And I'm trying to make this as simple as I can. And And those of you that's been around a while know that there's longer definitions, right? And in my opinion, in my very small opinion, there's more confusing definitions of critical and critical step, as I'm going to explain. So I want to reference it to just a procedure, right? So it's a step in a procedure that if performed improperly, again, there's the key word, will cause irreversible harm to personnel or system equipment. So I just want to leave it at that, as simple as I can be. And I want you guys to think a little bit about what that's really saying, right? And I want you to think back about some of you that are involved with job briefings and things of that nature at the close end of the spear. I want you to think back about how many times have you been in a job brief, a very important job brief, and somebody read a 48-page procedure to you, verbatim, word by word, at 3 a.m. in the morning, just before you went out to accomplish the task. And I want you to think about that and say, how effective was that? Even though we know we have to do job briefs, we know we have to have procedures, but now I've got this read to me, and after about the first 3 or 4 minutes, it all started doing what? It's just going away, right? So really, when we talk about critical steps and we apply this definition, what does that really mean? And where does it come into play? And how do we get people to see the beauty in that? And I think that's the key part. And I'll go ahead and say this from the definition perspective. As a practitioner, I think I'm fortunate in the fact that I worked in the technical side of the business, in maintenance and instrumentation electronics, as well in operations, a reactor operator, senior reactor operator, and I was a human performance manager at a nuke plant for a while. I know, pray for me. But the fact of the matter is when you got to look at it from the perspective of those extremes, right? You got to look at it from the perspective of, here's the folks that's trying to help us with process improvement and things we can do and techniques to make it better. But out here's the people that's got to take all that in and go, what do they really mean by that? And a lot of you have heard the phrase, right? I use it all the time, probably use it too much. How do you eat elephant? One piece at a time? How many of you feel like at the end of the day, when you go home, you've ate 3 elephants and you're still trying to digest it? It just doesn't seem to work. So critical step, again, is an attempt to narrow it down to where you really need to place the focus, where it most importantly can prevent the error that may lead to the event. And when I say may lead to the event, it's all not perfectly predictable, as you know. So I'm not going to say it will predict it every time, but you can make it pretty close to where it needs to be. So if you look at the 2 photos in this slide, you see a train switch on a track, and that's a remote switch, by the way. That's not a fellow that runs out there and turns it, like in the old days and gets ahead of the train changes tracks. This is a remote switch. So this is done by a control center somewhere miles away from the track. And those of you that's watched the events occur around the train industry probably ask yourself sometimes, how in the world could you make that error when the tracks are there and they've been there that long and everybody knows where they go and they don't change every day? How could you make the error? Well, if you think about it from the critical step perspective, you flip that switch and that train's right there. Can you take it back once the train gets to it? No. It can be latency involved with it. They could sit there a while, but look, nobody's around that switch. Nobody's looking at that switch. So that could be determined as a critical step. The guy on the right this is a great photo from way back in the day. And you see this guy looking at all the back of these must be relay panels or something with a lot of terminal strips, but he's sitting up there and what's the chance he's going to get on the wrong one? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Well, what's the chance? I don't see any barricading or flagging or any techniques used not to. But the fact of the matter is he could be at that point at a critical step and cause a major event, and that could occur pretty quick. So let me change gears here and talk about risk a little bit. And I'm sure this is going to get some folks kind of riled up and thinking in terms of what risk really is. But again, we can look at risk definitions and go back to Philadelphia lawyer statements and big thesis statements, and we can go on and on and on. But I'm just going to try to, again, make it simple for you. My definition is probability versus consequence. I'm sure it's a lot of your definitions. And I want to take it even further and say it's what's the chance something's going to happen, and how bad's it going to be? That sound more along the lines of the frontline person? How bad, what's the chance it might happen to me? And if it does, how bad is it going to be? So when I'm doing speaks, a lot of times I'll ask people in the crowd, how many of you work in risk management? Show of hands. Nobody raises their hand, and they automatically have this perception that risk management is a title that you have in an organization that you got assigned, and that's what you do, right? But I would submit to you that all of us work in risk management every day, whether we're in the pandemic, sitting at home like I am in my shop, talking to you over a computer, or where we're in the field doing work or at our regular jobs. When you think about that, I like to say, hey, how many of you drove to work this morning when we actually get to drive somewhere? How many of you drove to work? Well, everybody say, oh, I drove to work. So how many of you, when you pulled up at a stoplight and you stopped, or an intersection and you stopped, and you look both ways, how many of you remember seeing that truck coming, big truck, 70,000 gross pounds, twin axle, steam blowing out of it, black smoke. You look and you say to yourself, I can make that. And you mash the gas and you turn and you go, and you look up in that mirror and you go, aha, I did it, right? Now, if you were driving a Ford, I know you probably wouldn't take that chance, but if you're in a Chevrolet, you probably do it every day. But here's the deal. How many of you, are you managing risk when you do that? Are you? Absolutely. You're doing probability versus consequence when you make that decision to turn in front of that truck. You just don't process it like that. But the outcome is the same. So when you talk about how do we determine what a critical step is, right? That's the $100,000 question. How do we determine what a critical step is? You got to go to risk. And I throwed up the little risk model here, the old drift model that we've seen from normal deviation. It's been around and assigned to organizations for years. I take it one step forward and just put it down at the pointy end of the spear again, and just take the person and apply it, right? So if I'm a relay tech that's been in the business 35 years, and I know everything there is about switching and testing and trip path testing and lockout relays, I know it all. And this is not my first rodeo, but here you go, LD. Now you've come to me with a procedure now that has a critical step in it. Well, I know it's a critical step. I think all of them are critical steps. What's starting to happen with that mentality on that line? 35 years, I call it all critical because I know what to do. It's no big thing. I got this. What's starting to happen? Well, look at the model. Time over the amount of risk we look at or we perceive, right? Think about it. Does real risk ever change in your job? Seriously, does real risk ever change? No, we try to tag it, barricade it, block it, switch it out, cover it up, but does it ever go away? Probably not, right? But what does our perception of that risk do over time as workers or people that are actually implementing what we ask them to do or executing what we ask them to do in a procedure? Now that line starts to drift away. I marked the drift area there with the bracket, and I would submit to you that a critical step at that point does what? It brings you back to the focus of this truly is irreversible in nature, meaning point of no return. I can't back up. Once I close this breaker, once I open this valve, once I flip this switch, I can't take it back. Now, in the true scheme of things, when you're wanting to prevent events by error mitigation, that's a key part, right? And it's got to be based on risk. Got to be based on risk, right? If you remember when you think back as a kid, when we talk about risk and what's critical, think about the first time you drove by yourself, right? All of us can probably, I know I'm 60 years old, so I got to go way back. I know don't start the horse and buggy things. Rob Fisher, if you're out there, I know you're already thinking that. But again, we go back and we think about that first time we're driving, no parent, no instructor, by yourself. Got that visual back in your mind, right? Let me ask you something. Where was your focus that day? Where were your hands that day? Well, I was taught 10-2, right? I was taught that's how you do that. You have to have the 10-2 hand position. Where's my hands today? Where's my focus today? You know, I was raised on a dairy farm, so when my dad said, go get something the first time, I drove down this 2-lane road that was probably 25 miles long to town. And I remember meeting that first tractor and trailer on a narrow 2-lane road. And I remember where my hands were, right? They were right here. I remember where my focus was. And believe it or not, as a 16-year-old kid, I even had a contingency. And that contingency was, if that truck drifts across the center line, I'm going in that cornfield. And I don't care whose cornfield it is, I'm going to tear it up, because that's the least path of resistance. And guess what? Truck got by, I got by, everything was fine. Fast forward 35, 40 years. What are we doing today? We drift. So critical step does nothing more than bring you back and allow you to focus and keep mitigating that drift. It's just one technique that I think works really well with that. So look at some examples in the industry. And if I hit on some of the things that some of you folks know a whole lot more about than I do, please make a couple notes and let's talk about it in the questioning and answering session. But you know, you look at electric transmission switching and tagging. I work a lot with that now. I've been out of nuclear for quite a while now. I spent 30 some years in nuclear. I've been over on the transmission side of the electric industry now for 8 years. So switching and tagging to me is like lock tag out in a nuclear plant or lockout tag out in a fossil plant. It's the same, right? But when you think about the criticality of that, how important is that to a person that has to go out and switch a system out to do maintenance on it under the gun, under the time pressure to get it back by the end of the day? And where do they really need to focus? Well, they really need to focus on what's truly by procedure that's been determined that's critical. Not all the hoopla that comes down the path that you got to talk about in the job brief. I know some of you like me have seen job briefs go from a page to 10 pages, right? They end up being checklists. And when you have the event, you always go, hey, who's got the job brief? We got to go read the job brief. Well, who thinks job briefs prevent events? I would submit to you that job briefs set you up for success. They don't prevent events. What you do because of that job brief prevents the event. So the critical task in switching and tagging, or a critical step, is huge there. Relay trip path testing. Again, if you've got experience in relay work in the electric industry, that in itself is one of the most hairy things you can do on a day-to-day basis that affects the operation of the grid as we see it day to day. You got folks out there in substations and control houses right now that are turning switches that could put your city in the dark if they turn that wrong switch or open that wrong door at the wrong point. So we know that's a big deal, right? Grounding. Temporary protective grounding applications in high voltage settings, that's huge. A lot of people say, well, LD, that's simple, that's elementary. We've been grounding electrical systems for hundreds of years. Sure we have, and look how many deaths and look how many injuries we got around grounding. So what's really critical about grounding? I went out and spent some time with our substation folks in the actual settings of the substations and did some work with them in determining where those critical steps really were. And if you think about it, if you're gonna do work on a system and you're gonna ground it, there's a couple key points you got to get right every time, or you're not going to be successful. Matter of fact, you're not going to be alive if you don't do it the right way. And one of those, of course, is the live dead live test. That's a critical point, right? Grounds going up and grounds coming down. Those are three things. Those are three simple things that you absolutely got to get right. Power factor testing. Those of you in the industry may have known that as Doble testing. It's just it's a test system we run on the integrity of components associated with electrical equipment, right? I'm not going to get into what it is, but I'll tell you this. It deals with a lot of voltage, 10,000 volts, but no amps. So when you see people that work around it all the time, guess what they get the mindset of? Well, if you know anything about electricity, you know, what do they teach in school that kills you? Voltage or amperage? Well, they teach current in that setting, right? And they say, oh, you got to watch it. If you got a lot of current, you got a lot of amps, boy, that's bad. Well, 10,000 volts, we get in the mindset, it's just 10,000 volts. It'll bite you, but that's not going to kill you. That's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. In the right setting, that's as dangerous as it gets. So how do you do that? Had to throw a little bit in here about reactor solid state protection testing and troubleshooting. That's what I used to do years ago in a nuclear power plant as a technician. and that goes without saying, right? You got a 2 out of 4 logic system on a reactor protection system. 2 of those 4 gets met, boom, lights go out, poles go in the hole, day's not good. That's critical stuff. And there's certain steps within that that's truly critical. Heavy lifting and rigging. You ever drive by a construction site and look over and see a big 210-ton crane set up and they're getting ready to pick something and move it? Where is the true irreversible point in that? And think about the contingencies associated with it and how much thought goes into that before you pick it up. I know years ago, we didn't think much about that. We depended on that one guy in the crane that usually was a seasoned operator that really knew what it was going. He told us what to do and when to do. Nobody else even thought about it. Nowadays, you probably don't have that level of experience doing that same work anymore. So you got to start thinking about what's truly critical in that sense. The commercial aviation takeoff and landing procedures. I'm a pilot, been a pilot since 87, an instructor pilot since 92. So I can tell you that if you get on an airplane and you go fly somewhere and you think that the aviation industry hadn't thought about critical steps in the cockpit, you're wrong, because they have. And they do that particularly to prevent those errors that they know in the past have caused them problems. And they do that with 2 people in a verification process that does work. Works very well, actually. Offshore drilling and concrete integrity testing. I just threw that in there because I've got a little time working with that industry doing the Deepwater Horizon presentations as a keynote that I've been doing. And if you think about that, offshore drilling as a risky proposition, you're right. Thousands of feet below the surface, drilling and controlling it from the top is pretty testy, right? But what are the critical steps there? And if you remember the story of the Deepwater Horizon, you remember what happened, right? So somebody took a shortcut in a procedure, did not validate the integrity test as critical, and it ended up propelling into the event in itself, and the blowout preventer failed. So we know that that was one of the worst events in our history as a country. So what is the critical step? Let's have some fun, right? I wish I had this chat thing on there where I could say, how many of you by raising your hand has bungee jumped? So I'm looking at Steve's face and I'm looking at my face, and Steve's probably going, not me. And I'm going, well, unfortunately me. But think about bungee jumping, right? Think about that in a task setting. So if I'm going to go bungee jump, and I'm going to get up in the air so many feet over a certain object, I'm going to jump. I think about 3 things first, personally. The length of the bungee cord, where it's connected and how it's connected, and then the actual jump. But if I look at it from just irreversible factor in the step of critical, what's truly critical? What can I not take back? Well, here's what people think. I can measure and cut the length of that bungee cord all day long on the ground, can I? I lay it out there, calculate my weight, calculate the length, look at the stress level of the stress requirements for the cord. And I can do that all day long, and it's not bothering anybody. It's not irreversible at that point, right? Because I'm on the ground cutting the length. It's important, but it's not irreversible yet. How about connecting the cord to the jumper? Where do I tie it? Where, is it a carabiner? Is it tied in the front? Is it in the back? Where do I connect the bungee cord? Well, again, I can stand on the ground, folks, hook up a cord, stand around, walk around all day long. It's not met the critical definition yet. But most of you are thinking now, oh yeah, but when you step off of that platform, when you're that high in the air, when you're 100 foot in the air and you step off, can you go back? Well, unless you've learned to do this lately and fly, you can't go back. So you would call that, in essence, you would call that a critical step, and you would assure that those other 2 important steps prior to that were actually checked off, place, keep, signed, and done, right? That look good? So even starting a simple pump, second example. If I'm going to start a pump, we all know that once I push that button and current transfers, voltage transfers, and I move an energy source, I usually can't say, whoops, I didn't mean for 100,000 gallons of water to go over here. I meant for that not to happen. So we have to think about that, right? So before I start that pump, what's critical? Well, the pump start is, but look what's important. Breaker's got to be closed. Suction's got to be open. Anybody who's ever operated before has started a centrifugal pump without a suction valve open, went, oh, that's not too good. Discharge has got to be open, right? You dead hit a pump, you got problems. I love the little animation earlier in the video of of the pump sitting there puking fluid. That was awesome. That was a great pictorial. And then setting research. So again, my point comes back to what really is critical. And I would submit to you folks, if you really go down and sit down with your folks that work in the field and that use procedures, especially continuous use procedures, and you would start talking about all those steps and what's truly critical, you're going to probably end up, I'm going to go out on a limb and bet, but you're going to end up with 2 or 3 critical steps. And especially if you understand the task, what it's going to do, and what's truly irreversible in nature, you're going to understand that you're going to have a couple critical steps. But you also should understand now you can focus on that. So here's an example. This is an example. I took a very simple one from a critical relay work procedure that we use. And I just wanted to show you how you can incorporate that into a procedure format. And if you look at this basically is a procedure written to remove a relay, an SEL relay, and then replace it back with another relay. So if you don't know a lot about relay work, that's basically taking a component out, putting it back, but that component controls a lot of things. So basically got to switch it out to make sure when I take it out, I don't cause a problem. So, you do your normal thing, your level 1 safety assessment, you put your barriers up, that's part of our plan. You verify that it's ready for commissioning, which is a phone call, to clearance, a repeat back. But look at step 4. Step 4 says, in panel Romeo 7, open the following switches for circuit 1202. And notice out to the right of that, we have a column there that's checked yes for critical. So that person that wrote that procedure, who was the qualified relay tech, thought in their mind, based on the definition and their perspective, that needs to be critical. So with that said, the antenna, when that person gets to that step and reads step 4, of course they circle it first, then read it placekeeping, they get to step 4, the antenna goes up. Why? Because they see it checked critical. So now the antenna's up. And so with that said, those 2 contacts right there have to absolutely be open. If they're not open and we remove the relay, the world changes. The lights go out, customers don't have power, and it's a bad situation. So what have we done? We've listed it as critical. We raised the risk level perception up. We look at it, we make it happen, everything works good. Just a simple example where you can put that. So the challenge of applying critical step, here's where it gets interesting. And I do a lot of work in the field with folks. I go to the field quite a bit. I spend a lot of my time in the field, have a lot of FR clothing and hard hats and boots. But the fact of the matter is I hear this most often. Check it out. All steps in technical procedure are critical. Well, if everything's critical, what's critical, right? So think about that. All steps in a technical procedure, I would submit, are not critical. They arrive at a critical point, and then they move back again to a sequence. They arrive at a critical point, and they move back again in a sequence. That's how we write procedures. Now, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying that's how we do that, okay? So all steps in procedures, in LD's opinion, are not critical, okay? So let's take that into the matter. The second one I hear a lot from experienced folks, whether it's operators, technicians, whatever you want to call them at the pointy end of the spear spectrum, is critical steps slow me down. Okay, so what? Who votes that we need to slow down in our world? I vote for that. But we have a mindset that says, I got to get her done. I'm in the South, so excuse me for the phraseology, but I have to get her done, right? So you give me this thing in the morning, you tell me I got to have it done in the afternoon or by lunchtime, I'm going to get that done. Critical steps slow me down because I have to pause. We want you to pause. I heard a great quote the other day from one of our senior vice presidents. I love it. I want you to slow down to speed up. I want you to slow down to speed up. So critical steps, again, is that technology used properly slows you down, gets you focused, puts your antenna up, lets you apply some human performance practice, and then move past it successfully. Really, really simple in nature if you look at that. So let me kind of turn the panel here and talk a little bit about leadership's role and how we can better make this work, right? 4 things that I listed for you, and I want to make the point here. I think it's so critical that leadership supports this in these four areas of focus, right? First of all, make it simple. Make critical simple. Now, some of you may go, well, that's not easy. How do you do that? Well, it's not that hard if you understand that definition and you understand the work. Now, that doesn't mean that you go do that from an office somewhere hundreds of miles away from the work. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you understand it at where the work occurs, right? So how many of you have been on the receiving end of all that change and it gets to you and you're the person that's got to implement it and you go, who wrote this? So don't do that. Make it simple from the point of execution. And it, it goes back to, I think it go back to Covey's teaching, right? Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind. We'll try that with critical and make it simple. I think leadership, as leaders, and I consider everybody that's on this call and calls himself a practitioner in a sense around the word human performance and root cause, I consider you leaders. So I'm talking to you in that perspective. You have to communicate the why. You have to around critical, right? How many of you, if anybody's on the call that's read the book, Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink and Leif Erikson, if you've read that book, that's a leadership book written by a couple former Navy SEALs that fought over in Iraq in the Battle of Fallujah. If you read that book and you listen to what those two Navy SEALs say about leadership and what they say about telling their people why, it floored me because I always thought in the military, you just do what you're told, right? I mean, if those of you who are in the military, you remember boot camp, you didn't get a lot of why, right? You got a lot to do this. And if you don't do this, this is what you get. So you definitely got the consequence and probability part down pat. But when you think about what they tell you in their book, folks, as leaders, they talk about telling people why. Now put yourself in that predicament. And do you accept change better when you least have a chance to understand why? Or do you accept it better when you get that email on Monday morning that says, oh, starting tomorrow morning, this is how we're going to do things, and good luck? Again, it's not common, it's common sense, but do we miss that? Empower the end user. And I use that word empower, and I emboldened it in the slide. But I think personally, and again, LD's view here, we tend to misuse that word a lot when we talk with leadership, right? I remember when the word first came around in the mid 80s when, people were running around talking about quality improvement. And I think some guy was running around, flying around the country talking to people about, Tom Peters, I think was his name, about all this empowerment, right? You got to empower people. But I never once heard anybody tell somebody what that really meant. I heard it as a great word of the week, but I never really understood it. So I finally did. I worked for a guy, and he really did a good job. He said, I'm going to empower you, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a purpose. I'm going to give you some parameters, and I'm going to tell you what I expect. And if I give you those three things and you nod your head, then I think we're successful in that part. Man, did that make sense to me. I thought, yeah, that really makes sense. So from a critical step perspective, I want to empower people to use critical step technology at the pointy end of the spear. So I need to know those things. Why is the purpose? Here's how much you got and what you got to work with, the parameters. And then here's what we expect. Here's the result we expect. And I think it's good to know that because you can't set goals without it. And then last but not least, and probably most important from a leadership perspective around critical step, is provide instant feedback and consistent coaching. And Rob Fisher, if you're listening right now, thank you, because Rob helped me with that terminology several years ago. Consistent coaching, not constant coaching. Some people would call that nagging, right? Consistent coaching means I do it the same with Dean, I do it the same with Bob, I do it the same with Sharon, I do it the same with Jake. Consistently reinforcing the message about critical step. And really, folks, I'll tell you from experience, it won't work if you don't do that. If you just think you're going to take that out there and push the rope up the tree backwards with it as a practitioner in your organization, that's not, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it, but I don't think it's going to work. You have to have that leadership involvement and support to make that work. And when you do it, make it simple, you see a huge gain, I think, from that. So the strategy at the point of the end of the spear then comes back to educating and talking to people about how you do critical steps. We've talked through that and the why. But you got to allow the end user or the person doing the work, touching the equipment, you got to allow that person to determine and apply the critical step application from their perspective, right? Not so much from your perspective, but from the perspective of the person doing the work. I had a technician tell me one day in the field up in Ohio, I was up in Cincinnati and was working with a couple really, really sharp relay techs at a control house. And I asked him, I said, how do you determine what's critical? He said, well, LD, it's real simple. He said, I create an island. Use that analogy. He said, I create an island and I'm on the island. And when I get that island created, I know that nothing now is going to get me. Nobody can get to me. I'm on my island. And by doing that, he did a certain critical step application to make sure that island was complete. He didn't have no landing zones. He didn't have no piers. He had everything on his island. So he created the island. But it was interesting because it was from his perspective as a 15-year relay technician with a lot of good experience. That's how he looked at that. And he was teaching a new relay tech at the time. And I could see the kid's eyes just opening up when he would use that. Hey, create your island, meaning that, hey, you got all your critical steps figured out because you know now what's your reversible. Now make it work that way. Determine upfront prevention techniques. And again, if I know what the critical step really is up front, then I know which verification practice as a human performance technique, which verification practice do I use? Do I use a peer check? Do I use an independent verification? Do I just want to start, just want to self-check? What do I want to do? Job briefings. I've been in job briefings again where folks use critical step technology and the job brief, once it got to the actual step, really focused just on those critical steps. Why? Because we knew up front that those were truly irreversible. So not all of the focus, I'm not going to say that, but the gist of the focus then got to focus on those critical steps. So when we got to that, the antenna was up and we had talked through it in the pre-job and we knew what that meant. So again, tying that critical step back to that pre-job, I think is huge. Signature sign off. If you noticed in the example I gave you in our work, relay work procedure, we have a place for a signature of the performer and a signature for the verifier. What does that do? When you sign your initial or you sign your name, what does that do to the individual? Well, for me, it shows now that I own this, right? I remember years ago when Chevrolet and General Motors started the Mr. Goodwrench program. If you remember that, folks were taking their cars into these dealerships and getting oils changed and the technicians just didn't really own the process. They were leaving the oil drain plugs out, not screwing filters on, and a lot of problems. So the industry or GM said, hey, we're going to start Mr. Goodrich. We're going to have you sign your name every time you do one of these. You're going to put your name on there as the technician who did it. Well, guess what happened to that error rate? It took a big plunge because people started doing what? Owning the step of making sure the plug, which was the critical step, went back on that actual component. So again, signature and sign-off is just one way to do it. And last but not least, three-part communication and phonetics. If we use those at the right places, if we use it between two individuals to communicate critically at the right place, I think it's used a whole lot more sensible. And so again, critical steps can direct us to that, right? Last but not least, I'll pull up the old anatomy of an event just to get your thoughts stirring. You've listened to me mumble now for almost 45 minutes, a little less than that, so I want to make sure I'm on time. But many of you have seen this model. This model's been around a long time. This particular depiction of it came from INPO, the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, from years past. So when you see a model like this called anatomy of an event, I want to direct you over to the right of that where you actually see the initiating action piece. You see the technician here that's in a panel that evidently has lifted the wrong lead or cut the wrong lead, and there's been a defense that's failed and we've had an event. So I'm going to make this real simple. So first of all, it says initiating action. It doesn't say root cause, and thank you very much for that because that's probably not it. But the fact is, if that's a critical step, if lifting that lead is determined up front as a critical step, then what kind of defenses can you put in place up front, and what kind of error precursors can you talk about up front that just affect that critical step? So again, you see my point? You're focusing down to the actual action, not staying up here 100,000 foot in la-la land trying to do very specific technical work. You're getting down to that point. So when you look at that model and you see the initiating action, you see the defense is evidently is flawed, it's failed, whether it's procedure, whether it's whatever, an interlock, whatever, physical or administrative, the event occurs. We know what error precursors are. We know the time pressures, the error distractions, the workload, the night shift, everything there. Those defenses come in two forms, right? Administrative and physical. But look over here on the left side, and this goes back to the leadership part of my discussion, right? Latent organizational weakness. We've heard that term many times. We know what that means. But if you think about that in terms of a critical step, if we are over here changing goals, policies, processes, and programs every day, if we're constantly changing those critical processes that have critical steps in them, what do you think's happening on the other side of that model? What do you think happening every day when that person comes into work and has to do a task and that it changes? Well, here's the point. We're all in this business to prevent events, right? We're not going to prevent errors. We know we're going to make errors. We want to prevent events, or at least we want to try to mitigate that, right? There's a lot of discussion around that lately, and I'm not getting into that. But here's what I want you to think about from a leadership's perspective with critical step. Above this technician's head on the right, or the worker's head here, it says vision, belief, and value. Everybody in your organization has those, right? Especially those people on the front line. They have vision, they have beliefs, they have values. They may have were raised a certain way, went to a certain church, were in the military, whatever they were, they have those three things. You can't take that away, and a lot of times you struggle with changing it. But on the left side of the depiction here, and I probably you haven't heard this put this way, but above this leader's head, you also see vision, beliefs, and values. Well, our leadership, including us, have them too, right? We're no different. But here's what I would ask you in closing, and think hard about this when you think about using critical step technology. If these vision, beliefs, and values over this person's head on the left, that's behind the book, if they don't align with the vision, beliefs, and values above the person's head on the right that's working in the panel, ask yourself, what's the chance of event rate going up or down? And I'll leave you at a pause, because my thoughts are, if that disconnect continues, your event rate's going up. Critical step, if it's done correctly, brings those two together. Because on this side of the model, the process, being the procedure, gets to be looked at up front and determine what's truly critical with input from the field, and then the field executes that, and that side of the model supports it. And we prevent those events, at least occurring from that perspective of within the procedure. And that's what I want you to leave you with, that in terms of the leadership's thought process around critical steps. So I said a lot there. I'm going to back out of this now. I think I have a slide there just for questions. And Dean, if you're there, buddy, are you on here now?
I am on here now, LD.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. And I am going to pause for a second, because everybody, we've got about 12 minutes for Q&A. So I suspect we're going to have at least a few. And what I'd like you to do is, if you do have a question or a comment, you should be able to raise your hand. And if you could do that, then we'll be able to bring you into the conversation. Alternatively, if you just unmute yourself, I should be able to recognize you that way. Or chat it into the chat box, and we'll try to address it that way. So we do have one in the chat box, which is, do you have a favorite coaching perspective or resource? It seems we are thinking we are coaching, but we are really policing, as coaching is not telling, correcting, or providing feedback, but rather the most effective coaches use the language of questions.
Great question. And I'll do my best to answer that. And first of all, thank you for asking that, because I think that's one of the key points. And yes, I do have a perspective and a way to do that. And I'll start out with just a quick scenario and see if you recognize this. Those of you that's been coached before, or those of you that's been observed before, how many of you remember this? You get observed, and it's time to do the feedback session. And the feedback session starts with somebody reading to you a list of things where you screwed up at, right? And those are usually in terms of behaviors that you didn't get right. You didn't say this. You dropped this phonetic. You weren't standing in the right place. You didn't have your PPE adjusted, and it goes on and on and on. And if you remember that, and if you're on the receiving end of that in a coaching situation, you're kind of just listening, and you're forming all of these opinions as this person is giving you this feedback after they observed you work. Change channels now. Here's a perspective for you to try. If you go out and you observe someone and you want to provide them feedback, I would ask you to do simply this first. The first thing you do, the first question you ask in your feedback session with that person after observing them is simply this. You ready? Write this down. How do you think it went? How do you think it went? Not let me tell you you screwed up and how bad you are, but how do you think it went? Now, most of us, think about this, great question. Most of us, when they hear that, most of us are very self-critical in nature. And I know coming from the nuclear world and the aviation side as well, pilots and operators and technicians that work in those fields are very self-critical. That's how they get to their level of accomplishment, okay? So I'll just go ahead and say that. But when you ask that question to me, you say, hey, LD, how do you think it went? I automatically push rewind and I start thinking about the things I've been doing for the last hour as you've been watching. And I start playing it back and I start trying to find in my mind what I think went well and what I think went not so well. But here's the beauty of it. If you're doing the observation, you know how to collect data when you do the observation. Don't you have all those behaviors written down already as you observed? And I don't know about you, but when I do that, I just write the behavior and put a little up arrow for good and a little down arrow for not meeting the standard if I think so. But that's only LD's perspective, right? So when I ask that question, hey, Dean, how do you think it went? And then I open it up to Dean, I may facilitate that a little bit. If Dean's kind of stumbling with it, I might say, well, Dean, what do you think went well? Okay, that's positive. I can tell you what I think I did well. Well, Dean, what do you think you could improve? Well, okay, now that I think about it a little bit, maybe I need to work a little bit better on my placekeeping. I kind of got ahead of myself a couple times, forgot to circle the step. I catch myself. Yeah, that's great. You know, what are you going to do about that? Well, maybe I can go back and just reread that standard and see where I'm actually making that physical move wrong. And I'm like, hey, that's great. So again, as the person who is the coach, I want to facilitate discussion. I don't want to lead that discussion. I don't want to tell somebody right out of the gate how bad they are or how good they are. I want them to talk to me from their perspective. Because let's face it, folks, are we coaching for us? Are we coaching for them? And them being the person that's receiving the feedback. So that's my answer and a great question.
Yeah, it was a great question. And that whole, the point of being collaborative, having a discussion, and that people are far more bought into the solutions they help to invent, is right on. Thank you. And thanks, David, for asking that question. So we've got, let's see, Mike Blevins, you're unmuted. I'm not sure if you have a comment or a question, but if you do, feel free to jump right in. And maybe not. So let's see.
I got a question.
There you go.
I always have a question. First of all, LD, you are a fantastic presenter.
Well, thank you.
I did not know what a critical step was, and you know that because I questioned your title, the title of your talk today. And I'm going to frustrate you right now because I'm still not sure. Okay, you hung me up on the bungee jumping thing.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't the length of the bungee cord making sure that's short enough? Why isn't that a critical step?
So great question, Bob, and that question gets asked a lot. And in terms of the definition, and that's why I said from just the definition's perspective, we use the word irreversible, right? So the step of cutting the length of the cord, is that irreversible when we do that? Nope, it's not. Because to my point, we can cut lengths of cord all day long, but until we go 130 foot in the air and jump, it's not critical by definition. Because what's the definition say? Irreversible, improperly done that can cause irreversible harm to people or systems. So again, it comes back to the execution point. I would submit, Bob, that you're on track because the length is important to the critical step. but it's not the critical step. Just like starting a pump. A pump is the critical step. You can't take it back once you start it, but opening the suction valve is very important to achieving the critical step. You see, that's the thinking when you write the procedure. When you understand the critical step technology, you write the procedure leading up to those critical points. Not every step gets a sign-off and a focus as same as the critical step. Because if you think about it, Bob, if we called all those steps critical, what would then happen from the term critical in nature? It would start to be camouflaged. It would kind of start to be thought over. So that's my answer, and your response now.
Excuse me, that was only a 3-step procedure.
Yeah.
It could very easily have been a 20-step procedure where one of the steps would be get a bungee cord, lay it out on the ground, measure 20 feet, and all of those are not critical, I agree. Get a knife and cut it at no longer than 30 feet. That would be, if I was the one jumping, I would want that to be critical.
Yeah,
maybe we're nitpicking right now. I think I understand your point.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess a lot of times I think, and you bring up a good point, Bob, it's a very good point. The word important and the word irreversible can sometimes be confusing when you're in a procedure. I will tell you this, just to be honest with you, Bob, when I first started critical step technology years ago as an operator in the nuclear world, I challenged it the same way you did, Bob. I said, wait a minute. Why isn't this critical? Because LD thinks it needs to be critical, right? I'm the guy that's going to do it, so I think it needs to be critical. And if you remember in the presentation, I said, don't forget the perspective of the person doing the work. So, Bob, if you're the bungee jumper, your perspective is important, is it not? Very much so. So when you say, hey, LD, I think the length of that thing should be critical. Well, Bob, I'm going to be honest with you. If we wrote that procedure and you really want it that way, you have at it, buddy. You make that thing critical and you go get a verification. And I think that's thumbs up. I'm not going to argue with it because it's your perspective, but I will go back and say this again, to the flip side of that, in the technical world, when we're trying to do the amount of work we're doing on a daily basis, and from my perspective in the electric side, we have procedures that are geared to getting work done in certain amounts of time. We have tech specs associated with, you don't get but this much time to do this. Now, don't say you're adding time pressure, because of course you are. But the fact of the matter is, that's the way it is. You only get so much time. So to do a critical step and to really think it out and have it laid out and have it understood steps you through that, and it makes sure those true points of execution that are irreversible truly get the attention they need. But great question, and thank you, Bob.
Thank you, LD.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Good conversation. So let's see if anybody else wants to jump in with a comment or a question live. So we'll look for a hand up, or anybody that wants to just unmute themselves so we can pull you into the conversation. And let's see, Robin Waterman. Robin, what's your thought? What's your question?
Well, first I want to say, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay. This whole hour is like almost a repeat of a conversation I just had this week with our manager over substation operations. And he's from the nuclear field, he's beginning to bring in critical steps and working on revising procedures. My question is regarding workers and what you said about vision, beliefs, values on the organizational side. What are those conversations consisting of that you have with workers to really glean from them their thoughts? I mean, I know that there's a lot that we can think about common sense wise, but in your experience, what are those questions, comments? What do you glean from the workers to get from them their thoughts about what needs to happen relative to, I would say, overall implementing these steps, implementing HPI?
Great question, Robin, and thank you again. And her question is one that takes takes a little bit of thought process, and I'll give you.
It takes another hour.
Yeah, well, no, I hope not. No, I'm trying to do better than that. So Dean, that
I'll keep you on track.
He's probably got an old cane that comes across the screen. It catches me and drags me off. But no, simply it goes like this, and it happened to us the same way, Robin, when our transmission side started bringing more of the folks from nuclear in to share their understanding of getting things done. And I'm not going to stand here and say you got to do it the nuclear way or the transmission way or whatever. You take from both, right? We learn the good from both and move forward. But here's how we did it. When we introduced Critical Step, of course, you got questions just like what Bob asked earlier. Well, wait a minute. I think that should be critical, and that's a good discussion point. But how do you channel that back to that vision and belief from leadership and the organization and getting everybody on board? So here's what we did. We picked 5 high-risk areas in our organization. 5. We started with switching and tagging, relay work, Doble testing or power factor testing, lifting and rigging, and I think the last one, I can't remember what the last one was centered around testing of something. But anyway, my point is, when we did relay work, to understand Critical Step, myself and the vice president of that organization committed to a 4-week tour. We have business in 6 states in the Southeast, from the Midwest all the way to Florida. We committed to a 4-week tour where that person and myself got with first line leaders in the field, got with their crews, and asked if we could come out and spend time with them in the field when they were actually doing relay work. And we asked if we could have time to show up at their job briefs to talk about Critical Step. So you're probably thinking, well, who the heck has time to do that? Well, I hope you make time to do that, because if you don't take that time, you're going to be battling a Critical Step pushback that you've never seen before, because I promise you, technicians won't see it the way you think they will in that belief thing, just as you put it out. So we went to the field. We sat down in a control house with that vice president, who is a very smart person who has the knowledge and background to discuss the relay work, was a former relay guy. We sat down with those technicians, 1 and 2, 3, 4 at a time, and we had that discussion around Critical Step. And I'm going to be honest with you, Robin, sometimes it lasted for 45 minutes to an hour. But we had drawings, we had procedures, we had it all laid out, we had racks, we had switches, and I could turn around and point and say, so tell me why that's critical. Tell me why you think that's not critical. And then look at the definition. And our outcome of that was this. Oh, okay. So what are they understanding now? They're understanding why. And I would say that value in itself is huge when you can get the person in the field to understand why the person at the top of the organization wants to do things this way. And that's why I say the model that I showed you last, Anatomy of an Event, a leader and a worker, you have to make that connection. Critical Step's just one example. We can go deeper and deeper, but that's just one example. So I would submit to you that when you can look at risk, when you can pick 3 or 4 things that you know are high risk, and you can go out and sit down and examine the critical part of that, you would not believe the gains you will make in people understanding why. Thank you.
That is an excellent response, and thank you so much, because we've actually been thinking about a pilot, not in the Critical Step area, but in one area, but this is absolutely the direction that we're going to think about going in, because I like that high risk focus.
What company are you with?
Portland General Electric.
Oh, okay.
In Oregon.
Yeah, familiar. So if you need help, call me. I'll be glad to help you in any way I can.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, LD.
You're welcome.
Robin, thank you for the question. LD, thank you for that discussion. And I think we have time for one more. Looks like Galen Haygood, you may want to jump in on this conversation. What's your thought or question?
Yeah, so LD, I was looking back at the slide where you said the belief system of the leadership team needs to be in line with the leadership of the man turning the wrenches on the front line. And I remembered a story by Bob Edwards that always impacted me. he said that he had a senior manager that wanted to get more involved in observing things and had not really done that very much. And so they went on an observation, and their worker was working miles away out of town on a rig.
No.
Drove up there and they watched him. He was in a bucket truck working, and the manager was so excited because he leaned out of the bucket truck a little too far, and he wrote it on his checklist, and he was ready to tell him what he saw in the observation. And when the guy came down, Bob said, let me do the talking for a minute. And Bob asked the man, he said, what's the scariest thing about your job? And he said, really? And he said, yeah, tell me the scariest thing about your job. He said, well, the truth is I'm out here in the middle of nowhere, and our bucket trucks don't have outriggers, and I'm scared to death that one of these days the wind's going to get strong or whatever, and this thing's going to lay over, and I'm going to be laying here for days before somebody finds me. And so then Bob got his point across to the senior leader. It's important to understand the worker's point of view, and what he sees is critical. What he saw was critical was so different than what the senior manager saw. So you're
thank you, Galen. Absolutely.
Yes.
Correct. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Good example.
Yeah, that was a great example, Galen. Thank you. And we are with
that bucket truck leaning.
Yeah.
So good.
All right, so we are 6 minutes over time. So great discussion, LD. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for your energy and your questions. We are going to take a nice, refreshing 24-minute break and be back with some breakout group discussions at 11:30 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So we'll see you back here in 24 minutes. Specific with what we want to do today. So I am going to give you a little bit of insight about what we're going to do. And then I will give you specific instructions when we get into the breakout groups. So what I'll be doing is, well, first off, you've gotten an email about this, and I just want to reemphasize it. We'll use it only after the first breakout group. We're going to get some feedback from you about your breakout group discussions via pollev.com. If you haven't already been in there, it works best on your mobile device. Go into the browser on your mobile device, pull up pollev.com, and then look for the username field and type in 2019 HPRCT, and that'll take you to the polls that we're going to use. We'll do 2 breakout groups. The first one will be about 10 minutes. We'll bring you back together for a quick debrief about the themes and observations that you talked about. We'll then get into a second breakout group where we'll talk about key specific action steps that you can take in your organizations to put the learnings, put your observations really into some action in your organizations. And then we'll get into a discussion about that, and then we'll ask LD for some final thoughts and some closing comments. So here's what we'll do in breakout group 1, and I will chat this into the broadcast feature for your breakout groups, so you'll all have a specific topic to focus on when you're in there. What we want you to do is, when I put you into the breakout groups, just do a very quick round of introductions, who you are, your organization, that kind of thing. Just, a quick headline about yourself. And then we want you to focus on your key takeaways and insights from LD's discussion. What did you hear? What really resonated with you? And then when we come back together, we'll do a quick poll on the one word or the really short phrase that describes your key takeaways and insights, so we can see what kind of themes came out in your discussion groups or your breakout groups. So what we'll do is, I'm going to put you into your breakout groups. There will be 6 or 7 people per breakout group. I'll broadcast the instructions of what we want you to focus on. Just have a quick discussion on your key insights and takeaways. I may juggle the breakout groups slightly based on the balance to make sure they're roughly equal and you have enough people in there. If you need help, please look for the Ask Help button in your breakout group and ask me to join, and I'll pop in and answer any questions, or we can have a quick discussion on anything. So enjoy the breakout group. It will be a really good discussion. People are slowly starting to come back into the main room here, the large group. So what I'd like you to do as you're entering back in, go to pollev.com 2019 HPRCT, and just respond with one word or short phrase from your discussion. What best describes your key takeaway or insight? And what I'll do is we'll ask Bob Nelms as we start getting some responses to display that, and we'll ask LD to start with some observations and insights and thoughts as we start to see the themes appear. So getting more and more people back. If you haven't already, please go in and respond to pollev.com 2019 HPRCT. And Mike Kwasny, your hand is up. What can we do for you?
I'm just ready to start the discussion. Are we there?
Oh, well, we're almost there. So
all right,
Bob,
let me know.
if you could, thank you. Bob, if you could share out the results that we're getting, that'd be great. Excellent. So we'll do two things. We'll do three things. So let's take a look at the kind of the themes that we're getting, the words, the biggest takeaways and insights from the breakout groups. Mike, jump right in. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I shared with the group an experience that I had at PPL Electric Utilities before coming to where I am now. I actually worked with an amazing gentleman named Dean Smith on this project, where so I'd like to tell the story, right? I went out with a substation crew and talking with them, and they said, Mike, we're really tired of people telling us that what we think is a critical step is wrong. Okay, tell me more about that. And the guy said, I understand that by the textbook definition, the moment I come in contact with a conductor, that's what you're telling me the critical step is. Great, you got it. He said, but what's really critical to me is that I check for voltage before I do that. And it was in that moment where I went, everything he said in that sentence is absolutely correct. And it was the word critical that was just messing people up. It's got 4 or 5 different definitions for different people. And we were asking him to add another one on top of there. So we went through an entire campaign to change critical steps over to irreversible steps. I had a jar like a swear jar. Anytime somebody said critical step, quarter in the jar, and I don't make change. So we went through and did that change around, and it was amazing to go into the room. And when you say irreversible step, everybody's on the same page. There's one definition. They were right there with us. The other thing we talked about in the group is differentiating between a critical step and an important step. And again, in kind of the crude way, the easiest way to get guys on board with understanding where the critical step was just to say that's the moment where you find out if you're screwed. That really settled it for them, right? That's when the consequences are going to happen. This is when you learn. So it was a positive experience for us.
Mike, thanks for putting a smile on my face and sharing that story. That's great. And LD, what do you hear out of that, and what do you see on the screen?
Well, so I think he's right on target, and I think he hit the key point. And I'll go back to the presentation. It's the perspective of the person doing the work that can't be ignored. And we've got definitions, and you guys know this. We have definitions from one end to the other on perspectives of people who write great things and great concepts. And let's face it, that's why we're here talking today, because of all these people that have come on this human performance root cause trending board, and they've said, hey, we got an idea. And what's neat about that is you take all of that and you have to kind of put it in a big hopper like Mike was just talking about. And what comes out of that hopper are some pretty critical things, or excuse me, Mike, swear jar, click, or some pretty good things that really allow us to focus on what really is important from the person's doing the role, from the end user's role. And I think when Mike talked about, hey, people come back to us and say, hey, this is my perspective of what's critical. Why is somebody telling me what's critical? I think that's the key, is that don't forget the end user's perspective. Do not forget that when you're when you define critical, you're just trying to get people to start thinking about what that really is. And I think it worked, right? To Bob's point earlier, when Bob said, LD, I appreciate it, but I'm confused. Well, some people would say, well, I hate to hear that. Well, I would say I love to hear that, because that gives us a chance to, expand more. Like Mike said, never get to the irreversible word and focusing on that if you hadn't had such a question about critical, right? So I don't think there's no wrong answer. I think that was awesome. Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, LD. Okay, if we have one more volunteer to share a key insight or takeaway. Just put your hand up or unmute yourself and we'll draw you into the conversation. And if not, LD, the word that pops out to me when I'm looking at that screen, I see coaching, and I also see David Boyce has unmuted himself. And David, I bet you want to weigh in here.
I do. I asked the question originally, and I have, I'm very opinionated on coaching. I have, I've been researching it for quite a while, and I think that we can, how would you say this, advantage some of the more recent coaching perspectives. Because quite often we tie observations and coaching, and what I've found is they do not fit together. It should be a different word than coaching generally, because most generally we use observations to find fault. That's why I put, or are we policing? And so I'd be willing to have that conversation further on coaching. There's a couple of great sources, David Rock, Sheila, what's her name? Hine, and thanks for the feedback. There's Tim Galway in the Inner Game. There's, go back to, what's his name? John Whitmore, Sir John Whitmore. There's Michael Bungay Stanier, from 4 years ago, The Coaching Habit. There's, let's see, who else? Marcia Reynolds. She just came out with a book called Coach the Person, Not the Problem. I can go on and on. I've researched this, and I think there's a separation that needs to take place between observations and coaching. Coaching is separate. It's not the telling. It's more the asking, but the questions you ask, I think, will be in alignment with what, who is it, Sharon, that's going to be presenting this afternoon on clean language. Fits nicely with that perspective as well. That's my 2 bits. Any questions?
I have none. I just thank you for offering those insights. And LD, anything you want to add in a quick wrap up for this section to bring us home before we start talking about action steps in our breakout groups?
Yeah, so that's good, and I think those points that were just made about coaching and observation are very valid. I like what he said at the end, because he said, it's the question you ask, how you ask it, and it's from the perspective. And that's why I said when I was asking the presentation at the end, what do you do? How do you do that feedback? Well, I always start with that. How do you think it went? Because I do agree that coaching is, and whatever you call it, you can call it that, but I grew up calling it that. And I guess I played football, and, when I teach coaching, I use a lot of those examples. And again, I can use the right ones and the wrong ones, of course, right? So we learn from that. But I really think the key point is what the gentleman was just talking about, is how we perceive that from the end user and what we take away from that. Because, we as practitioners can discuss it all day long in a room like this, and everybody's got really good perspective. But really, does that really matter till you get it down to the point of where you're that person having to be the product of that, and does that make sense to you? And that's when I found, how do you think it went? What do you think went well? Those directed questions helped me a whole lot more than, hey, let me tell you where you screwed this up, or hey, you did this great, but I think you did this better. That kind of stuff is from my perspective only, and it really needs to be from the end user's perspective with that added, coaching, if you will, from the person doing that. So great point. Thank you.
Great discussion on takeaways and insights. So thanks, everybody. What we're going to do now is I'm going to put you back into your very same breakout groups. I'll give you 15 minutes. And what I'd like you to do is focus on the key action steps. Like, be very specific. What are the concrete things that you're going to do after this conference to put some of these learnings and insights into practice? Again, I'll chat that instruction into the broadcast feature in the breakout rooms, and I'll also keep you updated on timing. So go and enjoy, and reach out if you need help. Thank you. Okay, now we're starting to get everybody back. So here is what we're going to do. What I'm going to ask you to do is chat your concrete action step or steps that you're going to take after this conference to put this learning into practice. I'm going to ask you to chat that into the chat box. LD, what I'll ask you to do is Let's look at them, and everybody look at those actions as they're coming into the chat box. Let's look for some that we want to talk about more. We can draw people into the discussion. Let's look for themes. Let's look for any big aha kind of ideas that people had. So everybody, please go into the chat box, type those action steps that you're going to take, those concrete specific things into the chat box. Okay, they're starting to come in. Coach for consistency.
Or coach the coaches, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's the key point there. Great, very good.
Deliberate to
Good.
and to engage before observe. Interesting. Yeah, the nice part about this is we can capture all these and share them, via the chat log, which is nice. And we're getting a lot of really interesting specific steps. So LD, what are you starting to see as we're getting more and more come in?
Well, it's interesting. We're starting to see two directions here. We're seeing some about coaching, which I think that tells us something, because coaching was part of this, but it definitely was not the main part of it. But I think it's interesting that folks focus in on that just when they talk, not only just critical steps, but other things. So really positive, a lot of hits on coaching and how we do that. The other is identifying the critical steps, right? How do you really do that? And there's a couple mentions in the post here about incorporating them in job briefings, and how do you determine what that criteria is. So I think those are the two things. The coaching end of it came to the top real quick in our discussion chat, and then the other side of it is, of course, how do you know it's critical? And with the conversation about how you define it coming up, it's pretty good. So yeah, it's good to say critical step, not task. And that's very good, because you're getting even closer to the actual action. So good stuff.
Yeah, really good stuff. Discuss the importance of common language and definitions, building on that. Well, let's see, so I know a lot of people are still typing their thoughts into this chat box. Who has a question or wants to share any insight that you have about the next steps you're going to take? I'd love to hear from a couple of volunteers. So just raise your hand or unmute yourself so we can draw you into the conversation. Yeah, so we got a couple. I'll go to Michael Donovan first. Michael, what do you think about all this?
Well, I really enjoy it. Our path forward really is to get myself and the team more deeper understanding on the difference between a critical step and a task. That was a good note that was put on there. And then educate ourselves on more courses like this, so deeper understanding, and start implementing with our job hazard analysis, which those activities traditionally they have bundled up steps within a task, and we got to unpack those and then define the critical steps, and then make sure we have the important risks, important actions leading up to that, so that the critical steps, things like three-way communication or peer checking, are put in place so that that critical step is executed without harming assets or people. We have a lot to learn on this, and what I'm just saying is stuff I've read recently, so I'm sharing that with the group.
Awesome, thank you. LD, what do you think there?
So yeah, what he just said was key, and he hit on something that was also very good to mention. Is once you determine what's critical, what do you put there to defend against the error precursor that could get you to that undesirable point, right? And you mentioned peer checking. I personally, when you look at that in terms of critical step, that's one of the things we tend to struggle with a lot of times, because it takes two people, right? I mean, if you define peer checking by our standard, it's two people up front agreeing that what the performer's doing is right before the performer performs it. So that does take two people. So a lot of times in the operation centers and in the places where we're out in the middle of nowhere in a control setting or in a substation, we tend to have one person. And a lot of times that when you say, hey, go peer check, if you got a critical step, well, that's going to be kind of tough to do if you don't have but one person. So I think by saying what agreeing up front, what is going to be the defense? If you do determine it's critical, make sure your defense aligns with what the step is actually asking you to do. You mentioned 3-part communication. I mean, that one comes up a lot. Is, should I do a 3-part here? Yeah, well, yeah, if it's a control action, yeah, you should do that. So that's really key, and that's really taking it down to the level where I started in my presentation of saying, what's it really look like from the end user perspective? So thank you for doing that. That was awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And I'm going to go out on a limb and just call on a couple people here. There are a lot of intriguing next steps, but a couple, so Carrie Davis, I'm just going to see if you would like to unmute yourself and talk a little bit more about that, what that looks like when engaging managers and frontline employees and how that's going to work out. So Carrie, you want to offer any additional insights? There you go. Carrie, how's that going to, I think it's a great idea. How's that going to play out for you?
Well, I guess I'll find out. So
yeah.
I was sharing with the group in the breakout that, I work at Shell Technology Center Houston, an HSE advisor, but my specialty is behavioral safety, which has turned into human performance, learner's mindset, investigations and learning teams. So my anticipation is that if I ask managers and VPs what they would identify as a critical step with, say, bringing down a system or a specific task, and then, at a separate time, have them write it down and then have one of their, direct reports write it down, I think they're going to have different answers. I'm almost sure they're going to have different answers. So that just kind of opens the conversation between those two and helping to build that relationship to get aligned. Now, there's 41 plus lines of businesses here and another 30 contractors, so that could be tough. But I think it'd be a worthwhile exercise, even for an icebreaker before a team connect, to see how are we defining and identifying these, and are they the same?
Thank you. And I appreciate that you let me just cold call on you like that. And thank you for sharing those thoughts, that idea about like getting the conversation started and creating more alignment and just see, how close or how far apart they are, I think is fabulous. LD, what do you think?
Yeah, spot on with her point about asking the different levels of leadership what the definition is and then getting those answers, not that they're right or wrong, but just to show the point that, when you have those different perspectives, and if they're really, really different, what do you think it's going to be at the end when you're holding people accountable to do certain things a certain way? So I think that's really awesome, and it comes back to what I said earlier about telling people why. The more you can talk to them about why, the more they'll understand about what it really is. And I think if one thing we've uncovered here today is those two words, critical and irreversible, is I keep hearing people coming back to that. And this is great. Here's what I would do. I would take this back. I'd go back and say, okay, here's the word critical. Here's the word irreversible. Put some meat on the bone and ask people which one you want to use. And I think a lot of people said, we already using irreversible, because that makes sense. That makes sense to people who said, I can't take this back when I do it. Point of no return. I really understand when I close a breaker and I move this much energy, I just can't back up from that if somebody's still in the system. So again, I think that's a big aha moment in the definition. And by getting leadership involved and asking leaders the same questions doesn't do nothing but bring us closer together, right? It takes away that disconnect between vision, belief, and value, and it lines it more up and prevents the event. That's really great. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. That was a great thought. And Rob Fisher, you looks like you want to weigh in here.
Yeah, just very quickly about something you can do. Hey, LD.
What's up, Rob?
Just something you can do with the people in the field is when you have a critical or an unrecoverable or an irreversible step, drive them to verbalize that step. What it does is it slows the brain down to the speed at which your body can perform, and it gives them the opportunity to actually hear what might be wrong with that step. So, for years we tried to use STAR and things like that, but really if you want to introduce a tool that will work at an individual level and you want to introduce it on things that people know could really hurt, maim, or kill them, or severely damage equipment, critical steps or unrecoverable steps or irreversible steps are the place to do it. Say, look, whenever you know this is critical or irreversible, we want you to say it out loud. And tell them the reason, because it slows your brain down to the speed at which your body can perform. And then what happens is they start realizing the impact of verbalization on their own performance. I just wanted to throw that into something people could start doing tomorrow.
Perfect. Thank you for adding that to the insights and best practices that everybody's taken away. So really appreciate it, Rob. And I'm going to do one, see if we have any more hands up. And if we don't. So Galen, well, you just popped in. Galen, what are your thoughts?
So I know, Rob, I want you to give me a discount on your next conference for saying this. The performance modes, to me, is always critical. If the team does their pre-job brief, but then they get out there on the job and find things they did not expect, now all of a sudden something that really maybe wasn't critical in your early discussion has become critical, because things have changed and you're not finding what you thought you were going to find. And if it's knowledge-based work to where basically you really don't know what to do, it's time to stop work and get help. That's critical. So.
Thank you, Galen.
Yes, sir.
Okay, we have about 6 minutes left. There's one more I want to touch on here while I'm seeing if any other hands go up. And I'm going to go out on the limb again. And Adam Cunningham, the thing that you posted, your thought that you posted about creating psychological safety stood out to me. I do a lot of leadership executive coaching, and that one just popped right out. So what does that look like? And because I totally get it and I really appreciate it. How does that take concrete steps for you?
We just realizing that, everything that we're talking about here is predicated on the information we get from these people, these frontline employees. And, I was 18 years, I was a Boilermaker in a coal plant. So I was those guys. And it's just like anything else. You put garbage in, it's garbage out. That's, the stats guy. And so you got a bunch of people trying to put a lot of weight on your discussions, and they're making decisions based on information that's garbage. So if you can't get that psychological safety piece right, all this extra talk and all these steps that we're planning are worthless, and even could do harm. They could kill the program and make it look like it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, and then you never get a chance to go back, or you take years to recover. So ours is trying to make sure that, one of the principles, right, the response matters, that our leadership understands how the response is and that the actions they take reflect that. And as far as taking steps toward it, it's about language and using the same phrasing and language across the whole industry that we're in and all the different business units, and making sure that they know what they're saying. And just to point it out that I'm coming from an organization that historically has been very hierarchical and authoritarian, and there's a lot of scars from that. And so to move into this space where people start to say, it matters, I want to hear what you say, instead of just like what LT was talking about, the military, I said it, go do it. How do we get away from that? So we're putting in places things and looking at, I just lost the name, but definitions on psychological safety, and Tom Clark, I think, and some of the spaces that you go through those steps and how we do that. So there's a group of us trying to put together some language around that for our leaders to coach our leadership on how to create that space.
That's awesome. And I'm glad that you put that point in there. So thank you for sharing that, Adam. And we'll do one more quick comment from David Boyce, and then LD, I'll ask you to just bring us home.
Yeah, I appreciate what Adam just said. In fact, that author is Timothy R. Clark, and he just came out the book, 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, back in March. So it's a new book, but he has actually online webinars, one being on Friday, that talks about integrating those 4 stages. But I agree with Adam 100% that if we can integrate those 4 stages, first stage being inclusion, the next one being learning, and I think that ties into our learning teams. The third one is a contributor, and the fourth one is challenger, where it's so funny. We tell our new employees feel free to speak up and challenge us. So we have stop work authority, but we haven't filled in the bottom 3 tiers or stages of psychological safety to make it safe for them to speak up. No way you're going to speak up if you think your job might be in jeopardy, or you look dumb, or, you know, incompetent, that type of thing. So Adam, I appreciate what you sent me yesterday. I want to continue contact with you and continue on that discussion on psychological safety. I think it ties in with human performance really deeply. Thanks.
Good builds, David. Thank you. And Adam, thank you for jumping in there. And LD, couple closing thoughts.
Yeah, so thanks, guys. And man, that's some pretty good stuff. You know, when Adam said hierarchical controlled organization and you said scars, I started flinging, and probably doing the same thing because he came from the nuclear world as well as several others. So not that that's bad, but that's real. And so I appreciate that. And that's something we all should think about. But stepping away from this thing, you know, when we go back to the final thought here of critical step, that being one thing, and then how do we get leadership to help us with that? You know, coaching is huge with that, as it is with everything, right? And those things that we do need to be simple enough that people can understand why they're being coached and what they really are. You know, a lot of times people shy away from the simple definition of what human performance is, and I've learned it a long time ago, and I still go back to it. You know, it's behavior and results that get you good human performance overall, right? So you really can't do that without one or the other. I mean, we try, to Adam's point, we get really focused on results from a hierarchical standpoint, and we have a series of meetings that says you report to this one and you report to that one and you report to this one. When it gets to the top, we'll have that result met, and that's all it's focused on, is getting that number. Did you get it done? Why ain't you got it done? And what are you going to do next? But really, you know, to think about how you're getting that done. I mean, you got to think about the behavioral side of that. And, you know, behavior is what I can see you do or hear you say. I raised a kid. I have a 23-year-old millennial. He works for the industry as well. And I can promise you that definition got me through life when my son was growing up, right? What I see you do or hear you say, I'm going to call that a behavior, and we'll deal with that, right? Both good and bad. But I think the coaching piece and the critical step piece go hand in hand. I think if you work better to define whatever you define it as, it's your definition, just involve the end user. Don't do this in a conference room somewhere in a high rise or virtually on a Microsoft Teams or Zoom meeting in the next 6 months. Don't do that. Make sure you get input. And there's ways you can still do that. And I think that'll take you a long way. So again, guys, thank you so much for this time. This is awesome. My thoughts were this was going to be kind of challenging, but Dean, Bob, this was not challenging. This was very good, and it was very well organized. So thank you so much.
LD, thank you so much. And we do have one more hand up. So Robin, do you have a quick one for us?
I'm sorry, I didn't realize my hand was up. I thought I had taken it back down since we're out of time, but since it was up, I just want to say, I think everything that you just said, LD, and everybody else, and especially having people say things out loud, slowing things down, really focusing on HPI and these critical steps is even more critical, as we know, because of COVID. People's brains are changed. Yep. COVID, the economy, the social unrest, all of these things are just so major for people that we have to be even more kind of showing that care and that concern and helping people to slow down and giving them those tools.
Thank you, Robin. And so just a couple logistical things here. I appreciate those final thoughts, Robin. Well, a lot of great sharing, a lot of great insights all the way around. Many of them came in after we did that last debrief in the group chat. If you haven't already gone in and maybe copied and pasted them somewhere, you might want to, because there's a lot of great actions people are considering. I've saved it, so if you're not able to get in there and copy it and paste it, we'll figure out a way to get it to you. Just let us know. We are going to reconvene at 1:30 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time for an optional breakout group session. So these will be different people. If you want to come back at 1:30 U.S. Eastern, we'll put you into groups of maybe 12 or 14 people to just network, talk about HPC, HPRCT areas that you might need support with, whatever you want to talk about. We'll get started with the content at 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So thanks very much, everybody. LD, thank you so much for making this work, and enjoy the lunch hour. Take care.
Thanks.